Okay, thank you for your patience. So today's webinar is titled Core Outcome Sets in Randomised Trial. Our host is online and he'll be with you in a few moments, but firstly I'll give you a brief introduction. So it's Professor Declan Devane. He's an established professor of midwifery and holds the chair of midwifery at NUI Galway. He's also Scientific Director of the HRB-Trials Methodology Research Network. He's Director of Evidence Synthesis Ireland, Director of the Cochrane Ireland Group, and Deputy Dean of College of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences at NUI Galway. Declan trained as nurse and midwife, meandering his way into trial methodology and research synthesis, and his work now focuses on a blend across midwifery and the broader maternity care, randomised trials and how they're done, and synthesising evidence. Declan led his first core outcome set in 2006 and is or has been involved in over a dozen core outcome sets, including, for example, pre-pregnancy care of women with pre-gestational diabetes, fetal growth restriction, induction of labour, postpartum, haemorrhage, and cardiac surgery trials. He's also contributed to the methods of the development and reporting of core outcome sets. So there's quite some CV there. Today, Declan's going to speak about the core outcome sets in randomised trials. Before I hand you over to our speaker, I just want to turn your attention to the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into this box and I'll put them to Declan at the end of the presentation. So after that, I'll hand you over to Declan. Can you hear me, Declan? Just bear with me for one moment now. And
I can hear you. I can hear you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. So hi, everybody, and you're very welcome. I plan on keeping you for about 30 minutes, 35 minutes maybe. And I think there's a mechanism whereby you can type in some questions during the presentation and Vivian will shout them out at the end of the talk, if that's okay. So we'll also make the slide set available for anybody who wants it afterwards. Actually, the whole webinar will be recorded. What I want to talk to you about is the development of core outcome sets and particular focus on why core outcome sets are important, and that's identifying what the problem is that we have around how outcomes are reported in primary research and the problems that later leads to when you try to synthesize that evidence. First thing I'd like to acknowledge colleagues in the COMET initiative, which we will be talking about later on, but this is an international initiative focused on the development of core outcome measures in effectiveness trials, and indeed it has progressed beyond effectiveness trials into other types of study designs. We'll talk more about COMET initiative later on as we go through the presentation. So one of the problems we have is that we know we have a variety and inconsistency in outcomes reported in clinical trials. And that's very obvious to anybody who's sitting down trying to plan a trial in terms of identifying what should your primary outcome and secondary outcomes be. Often it informs sample size analysis or determination. The first question that people often ask is, what's your primary outcome measure? It also is obvious to anybody who's involved in the systematic reviews or other evidence syntheses of pieces of evidence when you've got wide heterogeneity or lots of differences in the outcomes that are measured and reported. We also have a problem associated with multiple outcomes. So there are other forms of multiplicity other than just multiple outcomes, but one of the problems we have is there's the challenge of us trying to identify what outcomes should be used for a population or a sample that we're interested in. And of course, those populations can differ. For example, children might need to be defined separately from those of other populations such as adults. The issue of multiplicity, we also encounter things that we do quite frequently. So we often measure the same outcome over different periods of time. That can cause a problem and a bias. The problem of subgroup analysis, which we'll talk about later on. You often have the same intervention being compared with multiple other different comparisons. So that might be, for example, being compared with nothing, or being compared with usual care plus something else. Interim analysis of accumulating data can cause problems with multiplicity, and also the statistical analysis methods that are chosen. One of the key areas that we'll be focusing on during this presentation is the problem of selective reporting, and selective reporting comes in different walks and sizes, but for the purpose of this talk, we're specifically focusing on selective reporting bias that's derived from outcomes. So if I give you a concrete example, so this is a piece of work by Žarko Alferovic and Shireen Meher, and they looked at what outcomes were reported in randomized trials and systematic reviews that looked at interventions for the prevention of preterm birth. So a relatively narrow area of maternity care and a relatively focused area for interventions, i.e. the prevention of preterm birth. And you'll see here in the abstract, and I'm just going to check with Vivian if you can see my mouse moving. There. Well, I hope you can see the mouse moving.
Try again, Declan, sorry.
Can you see the mouse moving?
No.
Okay, that's fine. And I might just ask one more second. Can you see? No, okay. If I'm just realizing here, I'm sorry that these slides aren't moving forward properly for me on this screen, actually. So just bear with me a second if I just change the setting here.
Yeah, we're getting feedback. Yeah, it's changing now. That's great.
Okay, sorry about that. I'm sorry about that, colleagues. We've just moved on to this the first slide, so I didn't find the problem. And this is the slide I'm on at the moment here. And I'm just discussing this particular paper, which is looking at choice of primary outcomes in the trials for prevention of preterm birth. And when the authors looked at the trials, you'll see here that they identified 72 different primary outcome measures were reported in 103 randomized trials. Now, if we go back to the title of this piece of work, Choice of Primary Outcome Measures in Randomized Trials, Systematic Reviews Evaluating Interventions for Preterm Birth Prevention. So quite surprisingly, you'll see up here, they only found 18% of studies reported birth before 37 weeks of gestation as their primary outcome. And those of you who may know the field, preterm birth by definition is birth before 37 weeks. So when they reviewed trials that had looked at interventions for the prevention of preterm birth, only 18% actually reported preterm birth as the primary outcome measure. It does make you wonder what the studies might have been reporting. And indeed, lots of the outcomes that people were reporting was birth at varying gestational ages, because of the absence of a standardized set of outcomes that should be reported. The authors of this study concluded that our findings demonstrate a lack of consensus on what the most important clinical outcomes related to preterm birth. An early example of some of this work, when I think many people who are doing research face this problem. So one trial that we were setting up, we looked at evaluating two different models of maternity care, and we sat down with the key stakeholders involved in this, and this was with obstetricians, midwives, neonatologists, general practitioners, public health nurses, and women. And it very quickly became apparent that the different stakeholder groups, while they may have shared some common outcomes that they felt were important to measure, there was wide heterogeneity in what those outcome measures should be. And we found 299 outcomes from studies that had looked at evaluating two or more models of maternity care. So it makes it very difficult then to design a study that might measure all of the important outcomes, because it's an absence of knowledge of what are important outcomes across the different stakeholder groups. And to design studies that would measure such a large number of outcomes to encompass, let's say, 299 outcomes, not only wastes resources, but is likely going to introduce its own errors associated with that multiplicity we mentioned earlier on. So then moving on to some of the reviews and synthesis of evidence. So some of these examples I'm going to go through now are taken from the Cochrane library, and they're taken from reviews that are highly accessed and highly cited, and for fairly obvious reasons when you see the titles of some of them. So, interventions preventing falls in older people living in the community. And one thing that the authors noted in the findings here is that we saw data for rate of falls, number of people falling, and number of people sustaining a fall rate of fracture, although few studies provided fracture data. Now, those of you who are working clinically with older people will know that one of the major concerns you have associated with the fall is a potential fracture, because of the potential that can have on decreasing a person's independence, the care that's required, the impact on that person personally and socially, etc. So it's surprising that, in my view, that these studies weren't providing fracture data. And again, this may raise questions around what's driving the choice of outcomes in some of these studies and these syntheses of studies. And we do have good empirical evidence demonstrating that healthcare professionals and users of the health service will have different priorities for outcomes that should be included in our research work. Another example is surgery for weight loss in adults. And this review, again, the authors found that assessing the risks of the different surgical procedures was hampered by a lack of consistency in reporting adverse outcomes. And they go on to highlight the importance of a core set of outcome measures so that a standardized approach is brought to describing adverse outcomes and how they can be developed. So if we give you an example of this particular issue around adverse events. So this is a forest plot from a Cochrane systematic review, and it's looking at in the area of a field of work they've been working with Professor Andrew Murphy, so around, for example, prevention of urinary tract infection. And this is a review that's quite amenable to the public, looking at the effectiveness of cranberries for preventing urinary tract infections. And when the authors looked at adverse effects, you'll see the wide number of outcomes that were identified across the different studies regarded as adverse effects. So, for example, stomach burn and general weakness, vomiting, nausea, diarrhea, gastroenteritis, and any other gastrointestinal effect. The problem with this, again, it means that if multiple studies are collecting different outcomes, then it makes it very difficult, or actually makes it impossible for us to take the full benefit from the individual studies that we could take, because we haven't got the ability to combine the evidence. And very often these studies individually are relatively small, so they contribute less evidence to help us make a decision by themselves, but combined they could produce very good quality evidence to help us take decisions. But that combining can only happen, that synthesis can only happen when the same outcomes are measured and reported. We also have a problem, even when the same outcomes are measured, that the time points, for example, of those outcomes could be very different across the included studies. So here's an example of using antibiotics for ear infection in children and looking at the comparison of antibiotics versus placebo. And the outcome we're interested in here is pain. And you can see the different way pain was measured across the different studies. Pain at 24 hours, pain at 2 to 3 days, pain at 4 to 7 days. And while in some ways it might be preferable and it might be judged as important that pain is measured across each of those different time points, the problem is you can see in this, not all studies measured all time points. Again, information is lost. So I mentioned earlier on that the multiple outcomes are part of that broader issue of multiplicity in clinical trials. And we have an inherent risk of dredging for data and finding something that doesn't truly exist. And we all come at data differently, and we often view things from different perspectives. So the infamous example is this lovely picture. And you'll see the picture represents a school of dolphins frolicking in the sea. I'm sure that's what most people have seen. So you have the tail of the dolphin here, down to the head. You have the head of the dolphin here, up to the tail of the dolphin, two dolphins here, another dolphin here, smaller dolphin here, one running up here. I'm sure everybody saw that immediately. We do all bring different perspectives, and I think it's that perspective that has led to a proliferation in the number of outcomes that we're seeking to measure. It's also important in terms of waste in research. It's estimated that about 30% of a trial team's time is spent collecting data that will never see the light of day. I think we all face that when we're filling out, for example, questionnaires, and we subsequently look at what might be reported as a result of those questionnaires, and you find that a lot of the items that are asked are never analysed, or if they are analysed, don't subsequently make it into the report. If I can quickly show something here, if it works. Excuse me a second now. Just going to try and grab a short YouTube clip, if I can. And this again, I think, just gives an example of how we can each see things slightly differently. So bear with me a second. So this is a song which I'm going to just play from the Beatles, and many of you recognize it. It's such a feeling that love. I was certainly into my 20s when I realized that they weren't saying, I get high, I get high. Again, different perspectives. And I'll give more examples of the impact of us each bringing those different perspectives to our choice of outcomes shortly. The multiple outcomes and the use of multiple outcomes is exacerbated by things I mentioned earlier on. Most trials that we conduct are insufficiently large to give clear findings for all the outcomes measured. So we have to rely on synthesis of findings. That synthesis can only happen when the outcomes are measured, the same outcomes are measured and reported, and then when they're also measured in the same way, which is the next part in the development of core outcome sets. There is a problem in the literature around dichotomizing trials into positive or negative trials, and people often associate the terms that a positive trial finds a beneficial effect associated with the intervention, which may, for example, be reduction in harms, and a negative trial finds no difference between intervention and control groups for the outcomes that are measured. Those words, as you can probably even looking at them, they carry connotations of perhaps negative being a trial failure. The only failed trial, in my view, is the trial that's not done, that doesn't answer the question. A trial that's well done, answering an important question, that finds there's no difference between control and intervention, is a very important finding. I think we need to move away from these terms and this dichotomizing trials into positive or negative, but unfortunately it's still widely used. We also tend to have a love affair with the p-value, and the p-value less than 0.05. You'll all know that the p-value is the likelihood or the probability of obtaining an effect for an intervention at least as extreme as the one in your sample. So, for example, let's say you had a vaccine study and it produced a p-value of 0.04. The p-value indicates that if the vaccine had no effect, then you'd have seen what you found in your study in 4% of studies due to random sampling error. And you might decide, I'm willing to accept that random error of 4%, and therefore I will reject the null hypothesis. So I'll conclude that there is something going on there between those two arms of that study. But the p-value addresses only one thing. It's how likely are your data to occur if we assume there's no difference between the groups. It doesn't support an alternative conclusion, and that is a very common misinterpretation of the p-value. There's quite a significant paper in my view where a number of authors, and this is gaining traction across a number of fields in healthcare, where people have sought to redefine the statistical significance value from a 0.05 value down to a 0.005 value. What difference would that make to the healthcare literature and to the effects of the treatments we have? And the conclusions, one of the conclusions in this paper is associating statistical significant findings with a p-value of less than 0.05 results in a high rate of false positives, even in the absence of other experimental procedure and reporting problems. One of the other challenges we have is in subgroup analysis. So these are my nieces, twin girls, as you can probably tell. And so the problem with subgroup analysis, when you see them reported, is that in randomized trials, subgroup analysis removes probably the most important aspect of a randomized trial. It removes randomization. So I've described it before as something like, this tale around searching for the pony. And for those who don't know the story, there was once a man who had twin daughters, and one was irrepressibly optimistic and the other was a real pessimist. And he felt that neither extreme was a good approach to life. So on one of their birthdays, he gave the pessimist, put her into a room full of fantastic toys and games, and he put the optimist into a room and it was full of manure, I guess, and he left them to it for a day. And he came back later on that evening and he found the pessimist sitting in the room full of the beautiful toys, holding a single broken toy, crying, and that sooner or later all the rest of the toys would break. And he opened the next door and his optimistic daughter was there, and she had a shovel and was digging the manure with gusto. And when he asked her why she was bothering shoveling manure, she said, well, with all that shit, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. And that is one of the issues we have with subgroup analysis. You can actually almost create a subgroup analysis to find what you want. So a famous example of this is in the famous ISIS trial. So the ISIS-2 trial involved 17,000 patients with suspected myocardial infarction, heart attack, and randomized them to streptokinase or to aspirin, or to both streptokinase and aspirin, or to neither. And the study found substantial beneficial effects for aspirin compared to the effect of streptokinase. But as part of the review process, the Lancet came back and asked them to explore subgroup analysis. And the team at the time felt, methodologically, this probably wasn't a good idea to start this dredging as such for subgroup analysis effects. But they decided to do one. But they did quite an interesting subgroup analysis. And their subgroup analysis is this. So they note that when in a trial with a clearly positive overall result, many subgroup analyses are considered. False negative results in some particular subgroups must be accepted. For example, subdivision of the patients in ISIS-2 with respect to their astrological birth signs appears to indicate that for patients born under Gemini or Libra, there was a slightly adverse effect of aspirin on mortality, while for patients born under all other astrological signs, there was a strikingly beneficial effect. Gemini or Librans shouldn't be taking aspirin, it can kill you. And again, that finding is a spurious finding, and it was just a means of the author demonstrating the caution and problems that may be associated with, can be associated with subgroup analysis. And some systematic reviews have supported that finding. Authors often claim subgroup effects in their trial reports. However, the credibility of subgroup effects, even when claims are strong, is usually low. Part of the problem is it's like throwing the dart into the data and then drawing the dartboard. The evidence, sorry, this is coming up a little bit differently than I planned, but the evidence looking at, well, we've now empirical evidence of outcome reporting bias. So, for example, outcomes, we know that outcomes that are statistically significant are more likely to be fully reported. And although outcomes may be legitimately changed during the course of a study, the frequency with which changes to outcomes are made in this review suggests that really we're not paying enough attention to identifying and selecting the most important outcomes at the beginning of the study, involving all the stakeholders that matter. In this particular review, 40 to 62% of publications had at least one primary outcome changed, newly introduced, or omitted compared to the protocol. And please note, this isn't outcomes, this is primary outcomes. So some approaches to this subgroup analysis that I mentioned, so some kind of rules of thumb to avoid some of this selective outcome reporting that often appears alongside subgroup analysis, is that subgroup analysis should be planned a priori. They should be justified to variables where there's a plausible hypothesis for why you might expect a difference between groups. That may be, for example, physiological link, pathophysiological link. We should be giving the pre-specified analysis we intend on using and explain the rationale for the analysis. We should avoid hyping subgroups. So in some, for example, groups that I'm involved in, there are principles around don't include findings of subgroup analysis in abstracts, conclusions, or in plain language summaries. We should focus on interaction and effect estimates and confidence intervals rather than p-values. And we should emphasize overall study results, again, not focusing on studies, on effect estimates or results within subgroups. So that gives a very good, I think, insight into that we have got a major problem and the role that perhaps core outcome sets could play. And kind of wrapping around that, we know that there are tens of thousands of research studies are underway and 500 are published every week. There's a piece of work published a few years ago, and sadly for some of my general practitioner colleagues on the call, it's estimated that for a general practitioner to keep up to date with the evidence base that they need to help inform the decisions that they may need to take with their patients, they would need to spend approximately 26, 24-hour days per month reading that evidence base. And that it kind of highlights the importance of the need for high-quality evidence syntheses of the global body of evidence on a particular area or a particular intervention to help inform these decisions, because it's simply impossible to keep up to date now, even in narrow focused areas of healthcare. It's made worse by studies that study the same topic describing findings in different ways, and we have good examples of that. And again, the reviewers and systematic reviews themselves need to bring together and make sense of the variety of studies that's out there. One of the challenges is that there's a variety of outcomes measured in a variety of ways, and we need to be able to identify what are the outcomes that matter to the stakeholders so that we can compare, contrast, and combine this research to improve healthcare decisions. So a core outcome set then could probably be summarized as, and we'll come on to definition shortly, an agreed standardized set of the most important, or the core outcome measures. It is often disease or condition specific. It might cover all treatment types or a particular intervention. It should include both benefits and harms, because most interventions confer benefits and harms. And we've been criticized in healthcare literature as researchers and reviewers for not including harms in our outcomes that we're conducting and are measuring and reporting in our prime research, and that we're synthesizing in our review work. It's not to say that these core outcome sets are the only outcomes that should be measured, but these should be measured and reported as the minimum. Other outcomes will often be collected beyond the data set. But if you have every researcher within a particular space, within a particular intervention, collecting the same core outcomes, then at least you increase the likelihood of being able to compare and contrast those findings. And they should be relevant to those who are making decisions about healthcare. And the way to make them relevant to those making decisions about healthcare is to ask those people who are the key stakeholders in that disease or condition what is important to them. So COMET defined the core outcome set as an agreed standardized set of outcomes that should be measured and reported as a minimum in all clinical trials in specific areas of health or health care. And it's by no means a new idea. It's essentially an agreed standardized set of outcomes that we should be measuring. Again, just highlighting the point that people say it's unreasonable to expect all researchers to measure all of the outcomes in the core outcome set. And when I hear that criticism being said, I think it certainly has got merit, but it might be that the core outcome set isn't genuinely core. It isn't applicable to that particular intervention, in that particular population, in that particular disease setting, for example, that it can be measured and reported in all of these studies. So it might be that the core outcome set is too large and it might need to be narrowed down. Some of the advantages of core outcome sets is that it increases consistency across trials. It maximizes for the potential for smaller trials in particular to contribute to systematic reviews of these key outcomes. And when you have a core outcome set, you're much more likely to measure appropriate outcomes because of the need in the development of core outcome sets to involve multiple different important stakeholders to determine what should actually be core. And here's an example within a review where you wonder is the who's guiding the decisions around what outcomes should be measured. So here's a review by colleagues and I around palliative care interventions in advanced dementia. And the conclusion of this is it's worth noting that one study focused entirely on process of care outcomes, while the primary outcome in one study related to the family and the secondary outcome of this study focused mainly on process of care outcomes. However, the 6 ongoing studies suggest there's a growing focus on outcomes of relevance to the person with advanced dementia. For example, comfort in dying and comfort in ended life, and of relevance to the family care, for example, satisfaction with care measured using the following set of tools. So again, a suggestion that the ongoing studies might actually be attempting to focus on outcomes that are of more relevance to the person with dementia and their carers, which does raise the question of, how are we deciding what to measure previously? Core outcome sets reduce the risk of selective reporting outcome bias because if people have declared in the protocol that they're reporting a core outcome set, then you would expect that core outcome set to be reported in the subsequent findings. And it's likely that core outcome set will be a much smaller set of outcomes than the researchers may have decided to collect otherwise. So it increases the efficiency with which outcomes may be able to collect it. So one particular group that's been working on the development of core outcome sets for many years is the Untitled group. And they've developed 9 core outcome sets for rheumatological conditions. So it's important just to acknowledge this work has been ongoing in a number of groups for many years. And there is good evidence that the use of these core outcome sets has created less of a problem around selective outcome reporting bias within that space, in that field. So the COMET initiative, which I mentioned earlier on, is an international initiative that tries to do a number of things, some of which are listed here. It was launched in a meeting in Liverpool in 2010. So it's relatively recent, 8 years old, attended by individuals from many different stakeholders, groups. And subsequent meetings and activity have shown that COMET is now a truly international network. And indeed, they had their, I think it was fifth or sixth meeting in Amsterdam recently, in early November. So what COMET's trying to do is to raise awareness of the current problems with outcomes in clinical trials, to encourage people to develop outcomes and uptake the outcomes, to promote patient and public involvement in the core outcome set development, to provide resources to facilitate this. We'll come on to what those resources are in a moment, to avoid unnecessary duplication of effort, and I'll explain that in a second, and to encourage the evidence base around the methodology for how core outcome sets are developed. So this is the COMET initiative website. So a few things here on this website. So you can search the COMET database for completed and ongoing core outcome sets. So you can see that it currently contains 802 references to planned, ongoing and completed work. But it's reasonable to suggest that most areas of healthcare still have an urgent need for the development of core outcome sets within that particular space. It's also worth noting that in our experience that core outcome sets are unlikely to be stagnant entities and will need to be revised as interventions, new interventions are developed, and as different outcomes perhaps change in their relative importance to others. So they should be reviewed regularly. The COMET database, so if someone wants to do a core outcome set, it's recommended and indeed encouraged that they would register their core outcome set on this website, which would allow others interested in that space to recognize that this team are doing this piece of work. It doesn't unfortunately prevent duplicate efforts going on by independent groups, but you'd hope that that would be reduced to a minimum by people actually visiting this website first. Failing that, it can act as a conduit to perhaps different interested groups collaborating. Indeed, we have some good examples of that having happened. There are some other resources in the website, and I'll come on to some of those specifically in a second. So the most important one of those is probably the next one, which is the COMET Handbook. So that was published last year, and it's a very comprehensive document which provides a overview of the problem of selective outcome reporting bias, and then looks at a step-by-step approach of the different methodologies that have been used in the development of a core outcome set. So it offers some nice guidance on the development, implementation, evaluation and updating of core outcome sets. And it too will require to be updated as the evidence base builds and needs to be built around the methodology of how we do core outcome sets. We also have a standard, a guidance on the standards for reporting the core outcome sets. And again, as with most core outcome sets, with most reporting guidelines, they're intended for the end use in terms of reporting the piece of work that's being done. But as many of you on the call will know, they're invaluable at the front end when you're planning your piece of work, ensuring that your work is planned and aligns with what might will subsequently be required as in the reporting standard. So a good place to start in terms of planning out your development of your core outcome set work. The steps that are involved in most core outcome sets that I'm aware of follow a series of steps. There are differences in how those steps might be performed. Often the differences today are relatively subtle, but again, I mentioned there is a need to build the evidence base around some of the decisions that are taken in how core outcome sets are developed. So one first area is defining the scope, defining how broad, how narrow the population, the intervention area that you want to develop the core outcome set for. Identifying the existing knowledge in terms of what outcomes have been measured in the past and are being measured currently. Identifying and genuinely involving the key stakeholders in this process. What method are you going to use to achieve consensus on what outcomes should be included in your core outcome set? Often that uses some sort of consensus development method, such as a Delphi surveys, nominal group technique, consensus conference, or indeed a combination of all. You need to consider the breadth of your core outcome set in terms of its national or international relevance, and most core outcome sets set out with the intention of being relevant for an international audience. There needs to be a process of regular review, feedback, and updating of that core outcome set. And there needs to be a mechanism in place for us to capture feedback on an ongoing basis on the core outcome set. Consider a process for how you intend on getting your core outcome set implemented. Of course, one of the obvious ways to do so would be for journals to require the use of a core outcome set when people are reporting the findings of their particular study, or when they're registering the protocols, that they must make reference to and include that particular core outcome set. Some journals have got together to do this work. So, for example, the Crown Initiative, which is an international initiative bringing together journals associated with women's healthcare, so obstetrics, gynecology, midwifery, and broader women's healthcare journals. Almost 100 of those journals have now come together to support the inclusion of core outcome sets within those journals. So that means two things. And it means, number one, they support and indeed encourage the development and publication of core outcome sets within women's health in their journals. And number two, they are not requiring at the moment, but I do hope that will come, but they certainly are, in their guidelines, are clearly encouraging and recommending the use of core outcome sets in the research that's reported within their journals. So thank you. That brings me to the end of the presentation. Hope you found it useful. I think visiting the COMET website is probably a very useful starting point, and the COMET Handbook for those of you who are giving serious thought to perhaps developing a core outcome set. I'll hand you back to Vivian.
Great, thanks very much, Declan. That was really interesting. I find it very useful. And so I'd just like to remind everyone that's attending online, if you have any questions to put to Declan, please put them into the Q&A box there at the bottom of your screen, and I can ask him those questions. So to just kick off there, I mean, I'm new to the whole area of core outcome sets, but I was just wondering, once you've identified what you want to measure, how do you go about measuring it? For example, if you've identified something like, say, depression as a problem, how do you go about measuring it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just to emphasize, so the core outcome set is about identifying what outcomes should be measured. So the core outcome set is about identifying the what. What are the outcomes that should be measured? But what you're asking is the next really important question is, okay, now you've said this is the outcome that should be measured, how should it be measured? And that is another important piece of work that needs to pick up once the core outcome set is developed. So depression is a good example where you have multiple tools in different populations, for example, for measuring depression. There is an initiative which many of people on the call may have, on the webinar may have heard of. It's called the Cochrane initiative, and they probably are the group that are best placed to support work around instruments, for example, that might be used to determine how best to measure particular outcomes. So it is an important piece of work to be done once you have the outcome identified that should be measured, to focus on how it should be measured. And I recommend people start looking at the Cochrane group for things that need to be considered, which are many, in how factors that might influence or inform how best to measure those outcomes.
Great, thank you, that's great. We have a question here from Andrew, and he's asking, what role is the TMRN playing in this area, and how can we contribute? And he goes on to also ask, how does the HRB respond to applications in this area?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So in terms of to pick them up, so in terms of the HRB TMRN, what it's doing is it's contributing to the methods for the development of core outcome sets, but also trying to promote the embedding of core outcome sets within research funding applications. And I know Andrew indeed has been a supporter of doing just that. Most healthcare conditions today don't have a core outcome set to help inform the choice of outcomes for primary outcome or secondary outcomes in trials. It is strongly worth people considering developing that core outcome set as part of the, for example, as part of the feasibility work of trials, developing core outcome sets, or as part of definitive work even. It may not inform that particular definitive trial, but it will inform future trials. So the HRB have funded the development of core outcome sets in specific areas. Of course, I would, but I do feel it's a worthwhile endeavour. From a clinical perspective, it will allow us to synthesize that evidence better. From an academic perspective, those who are interested in terms of the outputs at the other end, the core outcome set itself is more likely to be more highly cited than the host trial within which it might have been developed for. Because that core outcome set is applicable across anybody doing a trial or indeed some other studies within that particular space. So I think the HRB have been supportive of developing core outcome sets. I would encourage people to consider the development of core outcome sets within your own areas, and also consider how we might begin to further add to the evidence base as to how core outcome sets might be developed.
Yeah, great, thank you. Another question coming in here now. Oh, great, no, it's just a comment from Sarah Brennan to say thank you, Declan and HRB, for an interesting talk on a great platform. That's great. So if there's any other questions, pop them into the Q&A box at the bottom. I've just seen it here. Another comment here from Karina, and she's asking, dear Declan, how is your experience with the uptake? How is your experience with the uptake? Is this existing COS? My experience is there are many hesitations with core outcome sets.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a problem, and it probably needs a kind of a top-down and a bottom-up approach simultaneously. So I think as researchers and academics and clinicians, we need to be encouraging the use of core outcome sets in our own research that we're conducting. And I don't believe we're doing enough of that as a community. Number two, I think that funders now need to start requesting or requiring in their guidelines, if there is a core outcome set available, please cite it, please use it, or please defend clearly why you're not using it. And there are some funders that have made that move already. And I certainly would be one thing that I would encourage funders to do, and will be lobbying the HRB to do. The other thing is there are a number of journals now that are seriously considering mandating the use of core outcome sets within the research that they're reporting in those journals. So, for example, the Cochrane collaboration, so it would be regarded as a means of disseminating evidence. And there are a number of groups now where we have in it requirements. Is there a core outcome set in this space? If so, what is it? And if so, you're required to report it or give clear justification as to why you're not doing so. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach. I think we have a lot more work to do, but one of the analogies I'd make is that when the concert statement initially came out, that provided guidance to people for reporting randomized controlled trials, it took a number of years for that to infiltrate, and indeed it's still not used sufficiently, and there's good evidence to demonstrate that, but it certainly made a huge difference to how trials, the transparency with which trials are reported. I think we're on the same journey here. I hope it doesn't take as long. Yeah,
absolutely. I've got another question here from, let me just go back up here, from Mary, just asking, it's a burning question at the moment. How would you involve PPI effectively in core outcome set processes?
So I think there should be, and we've good experiences and good examples of having involved in all stages of the core outcome set development. So from being part of the team who's applied for funding, being an equal member like anybody else of the steering group and forming decisions. And indeed, in most of the core outcome sets we've developed, PPI has played a critical role in, for example, providing helping the group take decisions about how to make the core outcome set more meaningful for patients and the public. We have a lot of people around the table at steering group level, for example, who can speak to the research audience, the clinical audience, the academic audience, perhaps the funder audience, Equally so, we need to have people around the table who can help that group take decisions about how to genuinely involve the public in each step of the process of development of core outcome sets. So for example, in one of the core outcome sets that we finished recently, we have a series of videos online, one from a clinician, one from a researcher. But the first video that we produced was a user representative talking about the importance of core outcome sets, but in this particular field was in fetal growth restriction, why it was important to her and colleagues as parents of children with fetal growth restriction.
Right, okay, very good. That question also, a similar question from Alice came in again concerning PPI. That's really important. So that's rounding up our questions now, unless anyone else wants to add anything before we draw the webinar to a close. No, nothing in that. Okay, thank you so much, Declan. That was really, really great. And I just want to give a big thank you to you and to everyone who's posed questions and joined in today to the webinar. I want to just remind everyone to keep a lookout for the next webinar, which will be featuring on the upcoming events section of the HRB-TMRN webpage. So thank you very much for your time, and we'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.